Good day, everyone. This is Naval, your OLC for Purposive Communication. Today, we are to discuss the third lesson, and we are now in the sixth week. The title of the lesson is Local and Global Communication in Multicultural Settings. So let's begin. Today, we will learn about how to identify the local and global communication in multicultural settings. Let's start with a definition of important terms. They may seem big words like global communication, local communication, and of course, multicultural setting. What is local communication? A community that has been defined as a group of interacting people living in a common location, having common values, culture, tradition, and language. It is also being able to communicate in your common area using the local language or what we know as the mother tongue. When we talk about local communication, it refers to a group of people, say a community or a society, that has a common ground. They may be binded by because of the common location, their common values, culture, tradition, and of course, language. The local language or the mother tongue is the first language of a person. In the Philippines, it's not necessarily that everyone has Tagalog or Filipino as their mother tongue. It can be a different language actually, like people in the Visayan area or Visayas area and also in Mindanao. They can be different languages for the mother tongue. Now, on the other hand, we have global communication. This is on a larger scale. It is a term used to describe ways to connect, share, and relate to one person or group to another person or group anywhere in the world. If local communication is limited to a specific community within an area, for global communication, it is regardless of race, regardless of nationality, regardless of differences in culture. It does not only include, let us remember that communication does not only include verbal or spoken and written words. It also includes nonverbal communication, which includes body language, facial expressions, and maybe the tone of the voice. Facial expressions, body language, and gestures. Okay, so for global communication, there are generally accepted ways on how you can get your message across, even if language is a hindrance in doing so, because you tend to not speak the same language as other people from different parts of the world. So it composes of other means of on how to communicate, to connect, share, and relate with other people. Now, what is multicultural setting? It refers to a society that contains several cultural or ethnic groups, just like the Philippines. Schools in the Philippines are also multicultural in sense because students come from different cultures, from different ethnic groups like the Igorots, Bajaus, and the like. So they have different cultures unique to them, or they have different practices unique to them as compared to which have to be considered as well when you communicate with them. So that's a multicultural setting, several different cultures in one communicative setting. It is indeed a challenge to communicate to a person with cultural diversity because context may differ depending on the person's perception of word meaning in relation to their culture. When we talk about context, it has something to do with the setting. It has something to do also with the experiences that the communicators have. So, for example, in which context are you going to use such a word? The profession of a person also has an impact on the context. So, the context is the communicative setting. So, even the experiences, the level of familiarity, whether the topic is familiar to the person or not, the language being used, these are all involved in the context. Culture shapes so much of the way persons interact with each other. So there's a difference on how Filipinos communicate with one another. There's also a different thing how Japanese do it. So it's a matter of the differences in culture, which also influences how they interact or how people would interact with one another. Now let's move on to the next part, which is which are the barriers, and then the global communication in multicultural setting. What is a communication barrier? Barriers to communication are the things that get in the way of a message being received. Simply put, these are things that hinder or block effective communication. What is culture, on the other hand? It is the lens through which you view the world. It is also a group which shapes a person's values and identity. It's a group of, beliefs, practices, tradition that shapes a person's values and identity. When we talk about culture, upbringing is an important factor. Perhaps you might be a Filipino, and Filipinos are expected to behave in such a way, but then you don't do so. You don't share the same values like that because the upbringing would matter a lot. What if the upbringing is in your home, you're very Western? Your parents raised you up that way. So it doesn't matter if you are in the Philippines, if you're a Filipino, but then the upbringing would have a huge impact on someone's culture. Some of the barriers to effective communication are the following: we have language, medium of communication, personality, and of course, culture. Let's take them one by one. Language. If you don't share the same language with the person you're communicating with, that would be a barrier to effective communication. Number one, you will not be able to understand each other. Number two, you will find it difficult to express yourself as well using that language which you are not comfortable using. For example, we are discussing in English, but one student or probably an audience is having difficulties in understanding the English language. So instead of this lecture being beneficial to that audience, to that particular person, the language used in this lecture would be a barrier to effectively convey the lesson to that person who is struggling with English. Next, we have medium of communication. When we talk about medium, we have the channels. Channels of communication are the platforms of communication. For example, this platform that we're using, the digital platform, the Zoom app, this is a medium of communication. The face-to-face, which we had before, is also a medium of communication. Now, for these channels, we have signals. Any disruption in the signal can cause for the medium of communication to be a barrier to effective communication. So, how can signal be disrupted in digital platforms? Of course, we have to take into consideration the stability of the internet connection. And also, it requires power, it requires electricity for the gadgets, for the devices to work or to function. The next thing we have is for face-to-face discussions or for face-to-face medium of communication. Of course, in there you have the noise. The noise would disrupt the signal. There is also signal in face-to-face communication. Now, the external noise is a given because it can be noise literally coming from the environment, and it can also be with the present condition of the environment. It's non-conducive for effective communication. But don't you know that noise can also come from within the person? For example, lack of familiarity with the topic, no shared experience, no shared understanding about the topic. That can be a noise from within. What else? The physiological conditions. Say at the moment the person you're talking to is feeling hungry, really hungry at the moment. So it would affect how he or she would process the message. Right? If the person you're talking to is preoccupied at the moment with some other things, that would also affect how he or she would receive the message. So those are also noises, but they are from within the communicators. Next, we have the personality. Differences in personality can be barriers to effective communication. For example, person A is very straightforward. He or she would like to call people out whenever he or she wants to tell them something. But then person B is very reserved, non confrontational. Now, person B, the reserved one, did something which he or she is unaware that is, unacceptable for person A, who is very straightforward. Now, person A, the straightforward person, calls out person B, the reserved one. The reserved person, person B, felt offended and did not know how to deal with the call out made by person A, the straightforward person. Therefore, a miscommunication may arise. So, in order for that to be fixed, there should be a compromise. They should talk things out. Person A should explain that, oh, I'm a very straightforward person, that's why I'm like this and that. Same goes for person B. Is that so? Well, I'm a very reserved person, I'm non confrontational, so I don't really know how to handle things like that. They should agree in such a way that, oh, now that I know that your personality is like that, I should do my best to call you out uh, in discreet or in a very discreet manner, all right, so as not to offend you. Okay, and as a reserved person and knowing that you're a very straightforward one, I have to, not be very sensitive about it and try to do introspection as well if what I did is really wrong or whatnot. Next, we have culture. Culture becomes a barrier when a person has different language bearing and they have different interpretation of such words. So again, the language, which is part of the culture, so there should be a common understanding, a common familiarity with the language. And also, different levels of proficiency in a language that can also be a barrier to effective communication. Now, for the different interpretation of such words or gestures, even, let's have an example here. The OK sign or the OK hand gesture. Like for the UK, in the UK and the USA, it means okay, as in things are doing good, it's fine, it's good, it's okay. For the Japanese, it means money. For the Russians, it means zero because you have there the circular space being formed by the thumb and the index finger. But for Brazilians, it's an insult. For Thailanders, people in Thailand, it's also very disrespectful to do the OK hand sign. In the Philippines, it's fine. It's the OK, or it can also mean money. Now, it's just one hand gesture, but it can carry different interpretations and meaning depending on the nationality with their own different cultures. So we have to be very careful, all right? I believe other hand gestures, other words that mean differently in other countries. And you know what? In other parts of the Philippines as well, we have words like that, which is okay in Tagalog, but in other parts, say in Bicolano, it means a different thing. All right. So the best way to avoid misunderstanding is to learn others' culture and set an awareness as to how one will react and behave when such situation arise. Therefore, it pays to do your research. It's really important that when you are to visit a certain area, you are a foreigner there, as a part of your respect and regard for their culture, you have to do your research. Probably do a quick research on the do's and don'ts because you cannot learn the language overnight. That is impossible. So, might as well do a quick run through of the do's and don'ts, specifically on the offensive gestures, offensive words, and of course, it also pays to observe. You can also observe other people or the natives from there, what they're doing, and we can try to imitate or mimic. We learn by imitating at some point. So again, do your research, especially on the do's and don'ts, before visiting and setting foot on a certain or a foreign land. It is also relevant to know and understand the importance of both verbal and nonverbal communication and how it takes place in a multicultural setting. That's why I made mention earlier that communication is not limited to spoken and written words, which is limited or which can be highly dependent on the language. There is also nonverbal communication, which includes gestures, body language, and even facial expressions, which we can use to convey a message. You have to be wary of how you deliver your words or show gestures to avoid misconception or misunderstanding. Upon doing your research, of course, you have to observe and you have to be very careful. We have to be very careful with how we behave with in another land. We also need to behave accordingly in our own country, especially in the presence of a foreigner or a person with a different culture. Just a piece of advice, use formal words in order to not offend others despite of cultural differences. Just to be safe, it is always a good thing to be formal, right? But in other discussions, in our succeeding discussions, you would know when you can be casual towards a person, maybe even if you just met him or her. But just to be safe, if you're meeting this person for the first time and he or she has a different nationality or culture than yours, you always have to be formal and civil with this person. That's it. It's very important to learn about local communication, global communication, and the multicultural setting because we have to take into consideration the different cultures so that we could know how to appropriately and correctly react and behave whenever we're in the presence of people with different cultures and whenever we're in a multicultural setting. Again, it pays to do your research before setting foot in a foreign land. So that's it. Thank you so much for listening and have a nice day.